Throughout our lives, there are moments, events, and places that touch us deeply and are remembered with a wistful smile and a very special love. And if you ask any one of millions of northeastern Ohioans old enough to remember where many of the happiest hours of their lives were spent, they may well say something like, once upon a time, there was a special place called Euclid Beach Park. Euclid Beach Park, remembered by millions simply as the beach. Even now, decades later, how the name conjures up the smell of popcorn, the laughter of children, the happy screams of teenagers on the rides. Can you remember the sights, the sounds, the smells? How fast your heart was beating just before you topped the first hill on the thriller? Was it the ride? Or perhaps for the first time you had your arm around your true love and were holding on tight? For millions, it was both. And later, did you steal a kiss in the dark just before you went plunging headlong over the falls? Who could have thought that so much happiness and joy could be crammed into 75 acres of land? Yet, for nearly 3 generations, it was so. But that was the magic of Euclid Beach Park. And it was magic. Gone now. Long gone. Would you like to go back? Then come along, and we'll go back. All the way back to the beginning of the dream. Hurry now. The snows are melting, spring has bloomed, and any moment now we'll know that it's truly summer because the sign will change and, yes, Euclid Beach Park is open for the season. The park had its beginnings in another time, another century, and another way of life. By the 1880s, widespread industrialization had brought to millions of Americans a new concept: leisure time. The rapid spread of amusement parks across the country was a natural result as people searched for ways to spend this leisure time. By 1894, no less than 20 resorts and parks of various sizes lay within 50 miles of downtown Cleveland. In the fall of that year, a group of prominent Cleveland businessmen optioned slightly over 63 acres of land on Lake Erie, east of the city, and began to seek investors for a new venture, Euclid Beach Park. With the opening set for the summer season of 1895, workers hustled throughout the winter and spring to have the new park ready. But the park opened late. Not until June 30th of 1895 was the great pier completed and the owners could claim open daily all summer. From the beginning, the new park was a success. In addition to the bathhouse and the dance pavilion, which would become landmarks for generations of park goers, visitors those first few years could see vaudeville acts at the Avenue Theater. 50,000 people were on hand that first 4th of July to see the spectacular fireworks display, the beginning of a tradition that would last throughout the park's history. Euclid Beach grew rapidly those first few years. By the second season, the park had added a Ferris wheel, and a merry-go-round, and the switchback railway, the forerunner of the modern roller coaster. Powered completely by gravity, passengers on the switchback railway climbed the stairs to the upper level. And from there, it was downhill all the way. Of course, the cars had to be pushed by hand back up to the starting point. The park's success attracted private vendors who set up food concessions within and around the park. One such vendor sold popcorn under their family name, Humphrey. The patriarch of the Humphrey clan was Dudley S. Humphrey II. Over 20 years of financial reversals had reduced the once well-to-do family to near poverty. But in the summer of 1896, the Humphrey fortunes were once more on the rise. Inventive and determined, D.S. Humphrey had refined and patented an old family process for making popcorn. Selling from horse-drawn carts at carnivals and street locations around Cleveland, Humphrey popcorn usually sold as fast as it could be popped. Although their popcorn concession at Euclid Beach was very successful, the family reluctantly left the park after 3 seasons. In those days, most all parks were modeled after the famous Coney Island in New York, and Euclid Beach was no exception. The Humphreys, with their high moral standards, had found it increasingly uncomfortable doing business amid the seedy sideshows and the drinking and general rowdiness that went on in the park. After failing to convince the management to clean up the park, the Humphreys decided to take their business elsewhere. While the Humphreys continued to prosper, Euclid Beach Park did not. The park's early success had sparked nearby competition, and by 1900, Euclid Beach Park was in trouble. On a business trip to Chicago, D.S. Humphrey read in a Cleveland newspaper that the park was for sale. Rushing home, he made an offer, and a new era began. Dudley S. Humphrey II was a visionary and a man with a dream. More than 50 years before another man named Disney would come along with a similar idea, D.S. Humphrey believed that an amusement park should be a wholesome place. A place where a man could bring his family and not have to put up with the drunken rowdiness, the gambling and the sideshows, and the general seediness that characterized amusement parks of the day. The Humphreys were convinced that a better class of park would draw a better class of people, and could be successful even without the beer sales and the gambling that most parks claimed were necessary to survive. The idea was new, and it had never been tried before, and no one knew for certain if it would work. The Humphreys were convinced it would, and were risking their fortune on it. The spring of 1901 found the Humphrey family feverishly renovating the park for the coming season. Out went the beer garden, the questionable sideshows, and the gambling concessions. And down came the high fence that formerly hid the park from public view. There would be no secrets here, the Humphreys claimed, and they welcomed public scrutiny. They also informed newspapers and churches especially about the manner in which the park would be run. Finally, on May 27, 1901, Euclid Beach Park opened for the first time under Humphrey management. And the rest, as they say, is history. By the end of that first season, the park that had almost gone broke the year before had drawn nearly 1.5 million people. The Humphrey plan, wholesome fun, high moral standards, no alcohol, and a free gate, had been an instant success. To a public weary of unsavory amusement parks, Euclid Beach was a welcome change. Over the next 20 years, the park would grow into one of Cleveland's most beloved institutions. From the beginning, Humphrey policies were rigidly enforced. The park's strict dress code was enforced even on the beach itself. Bathing suits had to be modest, even by the standards of the time. But the family's conservative morals did not imply a backwards or old-fashioned outlook. Over the years, Euclid Beach Park would become a living monument to the ingenuity, self-reliance, and creativeness of the Humphrey family. Without a gate charge, the park could only make money on the rides and the concessions and the attractions. To keep the crowds coming back meant always offering something new without seeming to change too much. Walking that fine line became a Humphrey specialty. And so the park grew. Popular attractions in the early years included lavish dances in the pavilion to the music of Currier's Orchestra and others. The Euclid Beach Two-Step was a popular number written especially for Euclid Beach Park. Each year brought new wonders to the beach. To mention just a few, in 1902, the log cabin. Built for the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo the year before. Taken apart, moved, and rebuilt at Euclid Beach. 1903, the Flying Ponies, a kind of tilted merry-go-round. 1904, the roller rink, enhanced a few years later by a magnificent Gavioli organ. Also in 1904, the old switchback railway was replaced by the Figure 8, a newer, bigger coaster, and the first at the park to use a chain-driven lift. Through it all, the beach itself remained popular as ever, with its bathhouse and restaurant, and children riding the sea swing in the circular pool. And of course, the pier. Part of the magic of Euclid Beach Park was that in the midst of change, some things would be unchanging. Early on, D.S. Humphrey made a deal with the streetcar company. Streetcar service came to Euclid Beach Park, and the Humphreys retired the ferry service. But they kept the pier, which would remain a park landmark to the very end. What exciting times those first few years were. Always something new at the beach. A new theater, the World Theater. First in the country, built just to show those flickering miracles called moving pictures. 1907 brought the biggest coaster yet, the Scenic Railway. With its ornate towers and gracefully sweeping track, it was perhaps the most physically beautiful coaster ever built at Euclid Beach Park. It was also unique. The cars were controlled by a series of cables and clutches and required a pair of brakemen to ride along on each trip. Yet, in the midst of all of this excitement, Euclid Beach Park was also a place for peace and rest. More than 40 acres of the park was reserved as a wooded campground. Rows of comfortable tent homes could be rented, furnished complete with plumbing, gas stoves, and even refrigerators. And all of this back in 1907. Throughout the park, shaded walkways, promenades lined with benches, and winding pathways brought an atmosphere of tranquility to Euclid Beach that was both in contrast and in harmony with the excitement all around. To the end of its days, Euclid Beach Park was very much a park. By 1909, the beach was already starting to take the form that would be familiar to coming generations. That year, the Figure 8 coaster was replaced by the new Velvet coaster, known to later park goers as the Aerodips. 1910, and the beautiful carousel came to the beach. Elegant, graceful. Remembered and loved by millions, the carousel would remain to the very end. That same year, huge crowds came to the beach to watch an historic event as Glenn Curtis flew his newfangled aeroplane from Euclid Beach to Cedar Point and back. For the next several years, such flights became featured attractions at Euclid Beach Park. 1913, and yet another new coaster. This one, the Derby Racer. This one, too, was unique. Two trains raced each other on parallel tracks. And of course, known to later generations as the racing coasters. There were more leisurely rides, too, such as this miniature train. And speaking of trains, one of the most popular rides had neither tracks nor any set course. The Auto Train wound its leisurely way through the park for many years and was a favorite way for weary visitors to see the park. By the end of World War I, a generation of Clevelanders had grown up along with Euclid Beach Park. The Humphrey family and an almost fanatically dedicated staff and management established a national reputation for ingenuity and innovation. The park owed much of this unique character and atmosphere to the dedication and self-reliance of the staff. Innovation and creativity became legendary at the beach. And a perfect example is the circle swing. Built in 1902, passengers originally rode in wicker gondolas. In the 20s, the gondolas were replaced by biplanes and a raised platform installed for added safety. Well, by the 1930s, Buck Rogers was all the rage, and the park's chief engineer, Dudley Humphrey Scott, designed rockets to replace the biplanes. From drawing board to installation, the rocket ships were created entirely in the park's own workshops. Soon other parks would try to copy Euclid Beach, and rocket rides would become common. But these three magnificent stainless steel rockets were the very first and the finest in the country. Summer and the beach. By the start of the Roaring '20s, those two words meant the same thing for thousands of families all over northeastern Ohio. The streetcars to the beach were always full. Hard play left empty stomachs, but not for long. The hungry park goers had plenty of choices. From a full meal at Crosby's on the Lake, or a refreshing pause at the Soda Grill, or maybe just a cool glass of Loganberry juice. No trip to the beach was complete without at least one cone of creamy whip freeze. The name would change to Frozen Whip in later years, but that special taste would remain the same. You could even bring your own food if you wanted. There were lots of picnic tables, and the park even provided free salt, pepper, and ketchup. Generous? Well, certainly. But the Humphreys knew that there were some things you couldn't bring from home. And even a stuffed picnicker would have a hard time resisting the taffy kisses made right here in the park. There were gentler amusements too, like miniature golf and shuffleboard. Beauty pageants were a regular park feature by the 20s. And always new rides, like the whip. Try riding this with a stomach full of hot dogs. The mill chute came to the beach in 1921 and proved to be a big splash. And new for the season of 1924, the Thriller. Over the next 45 years, the Thriller would be one of the most popular rides at the beach and would become the flagship ride of Euclid Beach Park. These remarkable films were shot by park engineer Dudley Humphrey Scott, who made many slow-motion films of park rides in the 20s and 30s. Note the clock on the ground, which Scott used to gauge his slow-motion effects. The 20s were the golden age years for America's amusement parks, and Euclid Beachers were more golden than most. Crowds came by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and the beach prospered. New rides were added constantly, and older ones were modified. Some, like the Bug, would be familiar to generations to come. Others, like the Zoomer, would last a season or two and then be gone. Still others, like the Witching Waves, would appear in one form and survive for decades in another. The Witching Waves later became the Laugh-in-the-Dark and used the same cars. By the 20s, about 40 families lived in the park year-round. The Humphreys themselves, along with staff and maintenance workers and their families, gave the park life, even in the off-season. Winter was the time for modifications, for new designs, strategy sessions, and minute inspections of the rides. Attention to detail helped Euclid Beach Park keep an outstanding safety record throughout its history. As the Roaring '20s roared to an end, Euclid Beach Park looked much as it would for the remainder of its days. As more and more people came in cars, the main gate arch became a familiar sight. And already, waiting for the sign to proclaim "Open for the season" was a familiar springtime ritual. The beach itself remained popular as ever, and the fountain that would become another park landmark had replaced the sea swing. In the winter of 1929, a severe storm struck the beach, causing extensive damage to the pier and the shoreline. In a strangely symbolic way, it seemed to represent the economic storm sweeping the nation. The Great Depression had just begun, and for all concerned, there were darker storms ahead. As the grim weight of the Depression settled across the country, the beach readied itself for the 1930 season. Already, the special family that the park employees had become had learned to pull together. When skittish banks were reluctant to loan the park money that winter, the employees had willingly deferred their winter pay. 30 years of building public goodwill was about to pay off. If anything, the crowds that flocked to the beach that first year of the Depression were bigger than ever. Before the end of June, the entire staff was repaid. Not only would Euclid Beach Park survive the Depression, it actually prospered, although on a more modest scale than before. As hard times deepened, the park's motto, "Nothing to depress or demoralize," became a tonic to a depression-weary public. The park's free gate ensured a crowd, even if there was little money for much else. A nickel for the streetcar would get you to the park, where you could walk about and relax in the shade of the many trees, or stroll out onto the pier to fish and wish for better times. And chances were, if a few precious coins could be spent, they would be spent at the beach. The pier was a favorite place throughout the park's history, and it serves as a special illustration of Humphrey philosophy. The pier had served no real purpose since the days of the ferry boats. Each winter, storms and ice battered away at it, and each spring it would be repaired. It was one of the most expensive features in the park to maintain, and yet, to the public, it was free. Such was the dedication of the Humphreys. The 1930 season was also the debut of the highest, most unusual, and the last of the great coasters to come to Euclid Beach Park, the Flying Turns. Inspired by European bobsleds, the Flying Turns was an absolute marvel of engineering. Dudley Humphrey Scott recorded the opening day crowds and these spectacular scenes of the ride in motion. The entire ride lasted less than a minute, but few who rode the Flying Turns could ever forget it. With the addition of the Flying Turns, Euclid Beach Park had reached maturity. This aerial photo shows the beach in all of its glory. At its height, the park covered just over 75 acres, but seemed much bigger. Careful planning allowed for maximum use of land. A closer look at the coaster complex shows how the rides wound in and around each other until it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. The 30s still saw its share of new rides. The old scenic railway came down to make way for a redesigned mill chute, which became the Over the Falls. A few old-timers might remember the Redbug Boulevard, and the Dippy Whip. Some may even remember the Bubble Bounce. Of course, beauty pageants remained as popular as ever, and so the crowds whiled away the hard times at the beach. And speaking of beauties, the best remembered lady of all came to the beach in the 30s. Another decade began, and America again was at war. Amusement parks like Euclid Beach Park played a vital part in helping the public to forget, at least for a little while, the pressures of a wartime assembly line economy. Throughout the war, companies like Goodyear and White Motors continued to hold company picnics at the beach. And at long last, the park even relaxed its dress code enough to allow soldiers in uniform on the dance floor. Ah, the dance floor. The 40s brought the big band era to Euclid Beach Park. The pavilion, redone in Art Deco, filled with the music of many of the most popular bands of the era. And so the park danced its way to the end of another decade. Like the rest of America, Euclid Beach Park drifted pleasantly through the 50s. Crowds still flocked to the beach every summer, although most came by car now. Early in the decade saw the end of an era as the last streetcar came to the beach. In its final decades, Euclid Beach Park was still the grand old lady she had always been. This was the beach that most people remember today. Familiar and comfortable, like an old friend or a favorite pair of sneakers, the beach simply belonged there. And for millions, a day at Euclid Beach Park was like coming to a second home. The park had aged with dignity and grace. How many thousands of grandfathers took their grandsons out to fish on the pier in those later years, just as their grandfathers had taken them? How many grandparents watched with quiet smiles as their grandchildren waited anxiously for their very first ride on the Thriller, just as they had waited 30 years before? There were still new rides, like the Rotor, to test the strength of your stomach, and many old favorites, too. Many were unique to the beach, like the Great American Racing Derby, a favorite since it was installed in the 20s. The horses actually raced each other. The Gavioli still cranked out its tunes at the skating rink, and the Penny Arcade remained as popular as it had been since the park's first seasons. Other favorites included the Laugh in the Dark. The creatures inside were effective, even by today's standards. Let's go back for a little while and spend some time at the beach as it was in the late 50s and early 60s. How old were you when you first came to the beach? How much can you remember? course, everyone remembers Laughing Sal, who stood her post outside the surprise house for 3 decades. How about the Colonnade and the Kittyland rides? Many of them were miniature versions of the larger park rides. How many of these did you ride? Variations of many of the rides that were popular at the beach can still be found at parks across the country, like the Rocco Plane or the Flying Scooters. The Flying Scooters was especially fun because of the control the rider had over the ride. As the 50s drew to a close, it seemed as if the lazy summers at Euclid Beach Park would go on forever. Euclid Beach Park entered its 6th decade with the status of a grand old institution. It had survived and prospered through 2 world wars and a Great Depression. It had roared through the 20s and eased through the 50s. Whatever the 60s might bring, surely the beach could survive that too. And indeed, the first few seasons passed pretty much as they always had. But the nation was changing even then in ways that the park was finding difficult to adapt. By the early 60s, the dance pavilion that had been a main attraction for decades was now only open for special occasions. In 1962, the old roller rink was closed and converted to the antique car ride. That same year, the Turnpike ride was installed in Kittyland. Like many of the rides at the beach, these were custom variations of standard designs, modified by the park staff in the park workshops. A few common standardized rides like the Tilt-A-Whirl and the Swingin' Jim would also be added in the 60s. Although no one would have guessed it at the time, the antique cars and the turnpike were the last customized rides to come to Euclid Beach. 1962 was also the last year that Euclid Beach Park made a profit. By the mid-60s, as the song went, the times they were a-changing. And the changes were being felt at the beach. The summer crowds that once flocked to the park began to dwindle. And each season, the lines at the Thriller grew shorter. To a generation that questioned everything old and established, the beach was becoming perhaps just another tradition to be set aside. For whatever reasons, each year attendance at the beach grew smaller and smaller, while the cost of keeping the park going climbed. Rising expenses for maintenance, insurance, and taxes all took their toll. Perhaps a sign of the times could be seen at the pier, which grew shorter every year as the cost of keeping it repaired rose steeply. But even in those turbulent times, there were still occasions when the park could pack in the crowds. True to its history, Euclid Beach remained innovative, and in the 60s, rock concerts were held in the park. The Beach Boys were so impressed by the flying turns that they mentioned it in one of their songs. A reflection of the times, perhaps, political rallies brought some of the last huge crowds to Euclid Beach. Nearly 100,000 came to hear Hubert Humphrey during the 1968 presidential campaign. But such crowds were few and far between in those final years. Through it all, the beach kept its dignity and charm. There was still magic to be found. The fun and excitement that had drawn generations to the park was still there. The racing coasters, the laugh in the dark, the thriller, and the flying turns could still bring thrills and screams of fun. But often as not, in the later years, the cars would go off half empty. Although the Humphreys continued to keep the park clean and well kept, those who looked closely could see that the beach was struggling for its very survival. Change had always been a part of the beach, but the changes in those last years had a sad finality to them. By 1967, the bathhouse was gone, and a vacant lot stood where the aero dips had been. That same year, the Great American Racing Derby was sold to Cedar Point and replaced by the Tilt-A-Whirl and a small Ferris wheel. Yet, even then, few believed that there could ever come a time when there would be no Euclid Beach Park. The beach had seen hard times before, and had survived. Surely it would survive this too. And so the balmy days of summer passed. One of the saddest lessons of history is how little we treasure what we have until we have it no more. During the decade of the 60s, something like 25 amusement parks went out of business across the United States. Many had been grand old parks that had lasted for generations. Parks like Cincinnati's Coney Island and Chicago's Riverview Park. And in Cleveland, Ohio, a place called Euclid Beach. And so, at long last, there came a final day. September 28, 1969. It was a Sunday, and the crowds came to the beach for the last time. And although everyone knew Still many could not believe that it really was the last day. They wandered about the park, taking in the sights, tasting the food, riding the rides that had been a part of their lives for so many years. Surely the magic of Euclid Beach Park could not end. For years, the voice of park employee Art Steele had been a familiar sound for passengers on the Thriller.
Platform, you kindly stand behind the red line and wait till the train stops before you get in. You two fellas in the front seat, will you please get out?
And the train did stop. Forever. How little we treasure what we have until we have it no more. Where once there had been screams of joy and laughter, now only echoes remained. Over the next several years, the park that had meant so much to so many for so long slowly vanished from the earth. Why did the park die? There are no easy answers. Changing times, changing attitudes, a host of other factors all played a part. In the end, it was simple, harsh, cold, economics. The beach was, above all, a business. And when a business is no longer profitable, it dies. Throughout most of the 60s, the park lost money, until at last there was nothing to be done but to close. Who could have thought that so much happiness and joy could be crammed into 75 acres of land? But that was the magic of Euclid Beach Park. And it was magic. And if you ask them where many of the happiest hours of their lives were spent, they may well say something like, once upon a time, there was a special place called Euclid Beach Park. And so the long, beautiful dream that had been Euclid Beach Park faded away. Today, all that remains of Euclid Beach Park are the main gate arch, now an historic landmark, a crumbling section of the old pier, and the memories. Ah, the memories.